church needs to get back to basics. What do I mean? Well, here's a couple examples for you. The New Bethel Pentecostal Church in Louisville, Kentucky will be holding an open carry celebration at the end of June. What is that? Well, according to the Associated Press, the church is encouraging responsible gun owners to bring unloaded and securely holstered firearms to a celebration that will include patriotic music and a short presentation on responsible gun ownership and Second Amendment rights. On top of that, there will also be a raffle to win a handgun. Oh, goody. The event will begin with a picnic, and the funds raised will go to charitable organizations. Really? Really, New Bethel? I'm fairly positive that thou shalt practice responsible gun ownership is not one of the 10 Commandments. And wouldn't accepting the donations from this event be like a church accepting a tithe from the proceeds of lottery winnings? The pastor of the church says that the public cannot count on the government to protect them from these quote-unquote subhuman predators who would perpetrate criminal activity. He does mention the police. However, it is to say that they often don't get there in time to prevent crime. While this is true in some respects, there is an important principle being trampled on in his subhuman comment. Lest we forget, we are all creatures of sacred worth who are sinful, and that sin is sin no matter what form it takes. To refer to or to think of criminals as subhuman completely misses so much of who God is and what he thinks of humanity, not to mention things like turn the other cheek, beat your swords into plowshares, and love thy neighbor. The church needs to get back to basics. My second example, I recently received an email newsletter from Adam Hamilton. He's the senior pastor of a United Methodist church in Kansas called the Church of the Resurrection. He found himself in the difficult position of having to explain to the congregation that two of their pastors, one male, one female, had had an inappropriate relationship. Really. Now I realize I cannot know the whole story and cannot even imagine what these pastors and especially their families are going through, but this is a horrible situation in which these clergy have put all involved. It could have been avoided if these two had just stayed focused on the basics of our faith. Well, you might be asking at this point, what are the basics? Well, we all know what they are. We just have to start putting them into practice. We can start with Exodus chapter 20, or as it is more commonly referred to, the 10 Commandments. You know, the thou shalls and thou shalt nots, no murder, adultery, false witness, covetousness. If we want to get even more basic, we just have to look at Jesus' answer to the question, which is the most important of all the commandments, which takes place in Mark chapter 12 and then one other place in Matthew. He replies that we need to love the Lord with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and that we need to love our neighbor. Sounds easy enough. Then we look at Matthew chapter 25 and see that love thy neighbor looks a little different than we might think. It's easy enough to consider, but harder still to do. In the parable of the sheep and the goats, Jesus says we are to feed the hungry, give drink to those that thirst, clothe the naked, care for the sick, and visit the imprisoned. These are the basics. I often see Christian groups or individuals involved heavily in political, social, and ideological struggles. This is fine and can be very important and sometimes even necessary. But if we look at the state of the church in this country and in our own lives, things like attendance falling and churches closing, etc., shouldn't we also consider Jesus' words about things like splinters in your neighbor's eye and the plank in yours? If we as Christians are going to be mobilized for anything, we should be heeding Jesus' instructions from Matthew 28. He says to go forth and make disciples, teaching them to obey what has been commanded. He says to teach others to obey those commands, but hidden in there is the implied statement that says we need to be obeying them as well. These are the basics. Are we mastering them before we go out and lecture others for not doing the very same thing? Are we considering Jesus' words before we organize a church gun rally? Are we considering God's commands when we enter into inappropriate relationships, whatever kind they may be? I don't know what this Louisville pastor was thinking when he came up with this silly little event. I also don't know what could have possibly possessed these two Kansas pastors to do what they did. I do know that if they were worried about mastering the basics of the faith, I probably wouldn't be talking about them right now. Now, I mention these two people as examples for the purpose of illustrating a point. But this isn't about these people. We need to remember that we are all sinners who are recipients of the grace of God and need to work on this stuff as well. We all just need to get back to the basics. Maybe then we can worry about responsible gun ownership in the